The new Consumer Protection Act and its impact on the auction sector?
I mean, it's going to have quite a major impact. I mean, the Consumer Protection Act is quite wide, but the proposed regulations with regards to auctions really regulate the auction industry for the first time. And you know, if one has a look through the Act and the rules and regulations around auctions, there are many. Probably running into about 100 different rules. So it really will change the auction industry in South Africa for the first time, and I certainly envisage major changes.
I mean, obviously you say it's for the first time that we see some level of regulation. How has the auction industry operated to this point then?
Well, you know, up to now, it's really been an industry which has been unregulated, and I suppose many auction companies have enjoyed working in a very unregulated environment. The Consumer Protection Act has brought in a whole host of regulations, quite similar to what we saw in Australia in 2007. And the auctioneers will now be operating in an environment where so many aspects of the industry will be regulated. I mean, it really goes into great depth and great detail. You know, up to now, auctioneers have, if they've sold fixed property, fall under the State Agency Affairs Act, but that caters for an aspect of auctions, but not the entire industry. And so up to now, really, auctioneers have been sort of setting the rules themselves, I suppose.
What sort of clarity are we going to get? And I'm talking about a range of issues, from reserve prices to vendor bidding to registration to auction results. What sort of clarity will the new regulations ensure that there is?
Well, I mean, you know, one must bear in mind that the Consumer Protection Act does look after consumers, and one also must bear in mind that juristic entities over 3 million rand are not covered by the Act. But that being said, because as auctioneers one never knows who's going to be purchasing at the actual auction, we certainly are in an environment where every auction will therefore be governed by the rules of the Consumer Protection Act. But the various issues which it sort of creates protection for the consumer range from advertising, the guidelines go into great detail about how auctions should be advertised, the actual auction itself on auction day. For example, consumers are allowed to know who's bidding at the auction sale. In the case of sales and execution, a very large sector of the market, if banks are bidding, they can know who's bidding. They can actually have access to the auctioneer's records, his details, for 3 years after the actual auction sale. At the auction sale, the consumer has the right to have a whole host of information given to him or her. So it's quite wide-ranging, it's quite far-reaching, and really does protect the consumer.
Obviously, a lot of South Africans like to sell or buy their cars through an auction. Specifically, how's this segment of the market going to be impacted?
Well, again, I mean, motor cars gets quite a lot of attention and focus, and I suppose because it's quite a large sector of the market, and it's been burgeoning for the last few years because of car repossession auctions. But the guidelines go into great detail, and I think the greatest information is really the disclosure about the cars, because people have purchased second-hand vehicles on auction before, and they didn't know who the previous owners were, they didn't have engine numbers, they didn't know the great detail of that motor vehicle. And so the guidelines go into almost 30 different aspects of disclosure to the consumer.
In the housing market, obviously, that's also where we've seen unfortunate repossessions, and obviously with the economy picking up, we may see less of that. But how do the rules inform the property sector?
Well, I mean, in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, goods are defined as real estate as well, and I suppose that's put a lot of the state agents sort of up in arms, because the Act really is quite wide-ranging, and it really covers real estate as well. And certainly there will be a huge impact on real estate auctions. I think probably one of the most interesting aspects of the Act is that in terms of the rule section 45, which is the one that deals with auctions, that auctions are actually excluded from a cool-off period, which is, I suppose, the very nature of an auction is that it's a final sale. So there is the Voetstoots clause, which has been much debated, actually does apply to auctions. So there's no cool-off period at auctions, which is certainly a positive, and we see it growing in the auction sector. But from a real estate perspective, there is, again, this big disclosure that is required for property auctions. Again, the same rules that apply of how the auction is conducted, where it's conducted, how it's advertised, how it's marketed, the rules of the auction sale, and all the aspects which would pertain to movable consumer goods would apply to real estate as well. And so consumers have enormous protection when it comes to auction sales.
In a sentence, is the auction industry ready for this change in status quo?
Well, I think certain aspects yet and certain not. I certainly think the larger companies have geared up, the smaller ones probably not.